Gru and company get on so many crazy adventures, it's hard to fit them all in one movie. Let's look at some scenes that didn't quite make the cut in the Despicable Me franchise. Number 1. It's not surprising that this scene got stabbed, cut from the final film. In an early trailer for the first Minions movie that didn't originally air in the United States but did air in France, a never-to-be-revealed leader was shown. It included a scene where the Minions are beginning to follow a medieval leader, who looks like some kind of a knight during the Dark Ages. The knight in question walks onto a balcony two of the Minions are currently washing, only to slip and fall on the improperly cleaned floor. Those mischievous Minions begin to laugh at their leader, thinking this is hilarious, until the knight's sword makes a return trip from up in the air, down from the heavens, where it finally finds itself inside the leader's chest. Yikes. And yes, that trailer was shown publicly on TV, and it was from a film designed for children. So, not much explanation for why it did not end up in the final film. We still think it's hilarious though. Number 2. You think our little yellow pals would have learned their lesson from following the T-Rex earlier in history. In this next deleted scene, our little Minions are sitting in what looks like a frozen over circus. We never have context as to why they are in this setting, but it appears that they are following, of all things, a seal at this time? Or maybe they were following a clown who perished due to something they did? Anyway, the Minions are far from thrilled with their current situation. In the trailer this scene appears in, the narrator states, "If this went on much longer, they'd surely perish." A concept which was best cut from the film, as this piece of information makes the Minions search for a leader based on survival. A weird introduction of mortality into what's meant as a lighthearted film. It's much funnier if the Minions just want a leader, you know? Number 3. Some people have more problems with their reflection than others. This deleted scene from the Minions film featured one of our Minion friends having some fun with a gaggle of mirrors. They become very entranced by their image, pressing their Minion butt against their reflection and dancing around. They dance all the way to a place where the mirror ends, but luckily, another Minion is there to replace them in the quote-unquote mirror. The Minion continues to dance around until the Minion pretending to be their reflection decides once they turn, they'll jump and scare the Minions out of them. Which they do. Not sure why this was cut out of the film. Maybe they were worried people would think the Minions were too mean? We already know they have a mean streak though. Number 4. What a little stinker that Edith is. In Despicable Me 3, when Edith and Agnes spend time away from the mansion together, Edith tells Agnes she really wants to go back to the mansion, capturing more of Edith's mischievous side. Not that she keeps that side very hidden, she wants to get back to the mansion as soon as possible because the butler Fritz is covered in itching powder that she planted in his underwear drawer. Then we are treated to a montage of poor Fritz having an agonizing day covered in some kind of itchy substance, using some egg beaters to soothe his itches, then using a bath scrubber and toothbrush to try and solve his problem, then crawling around on the top of a flight of stairs rubbing his back like a cat, leading him to accidentally fall down the stairs. While we're always ready for more pratfalls and physical comedy, maybe this scene got cut because this was taking Edith's pranking just a bit too far. Number 5. Seems like the filmmakers are not a big fan of surprises. In a deleted scene in Drew's mansion in Despicable Me 3, while the two brothers are wearing their spy costumes and examining one of Drew's many weapons, Lucy walks in pretty annoyed, believing they're going to both become villains. While this scene was deleted, a similar scene still makes it into the film. While Lucy walks by a window in Drew's mansion, she sees the brothers both boating off in their spy uniforms, looking quite annoyed. So really just a streamlined version of the original scene. Fair enough. Number 6. Do you know the lyrics for Karma Chameleon by Culture Club? Trey Parker, the voice actor for the villain of the film, Balthazar Bratt, sure does. Unfortunately, some of the songs Trey sang didn't make it into the final film. Trey Parker loves some improvised dialogue and singing songs, but most of what he sang for the film didn't make it into the final cut, including his rendition of the 80s song Karma Chameleon. There was a scene of Bratt fighting Gru while singing the song, which was eventually cut from the film. At the very least, Trey ended up singing Hug Me, written by Pharrell Williams, so he didn't miss out on those famous comedy pipes. Number 7. The cake was not the only thing to get cut during the dinner scene in Despicable Me 3. Originally, Drew and Gru goofed around a lot more before they had their family dinner than what ended up being in the final film. The brothers' banter was originally going to be over 3 minutes long, and the scene was even more complicated given the fact that Steve Carell voiced both characters. So in a heavy banter conversation, Steve would have had to play each character imitating the other character in a conversation between each character. Tough, right? While the scene got cut down, Carell still had many instances when these characters would be bantering with each other. So to make scenes like this easier, Carell recorded all of GRU'S lines first, then recorded Drew's lines while hearing GRU'S lines being played back to him. Still sounds pretty hard. Number 8. Children can be so cruel. In a deleted scene from Despicable Me 2, we get a peek into why Gru has such trouble making romantic connections. In a flashback scene, we see young little Gru with a flower attempting to speak to some girls during his childhood. Unfortunately, Gru gets bullied by the children, who evade him because they all say he has the Gruties, cooties that only come from Gru. We don't really need to say this, but this is a fictional disease, okay? If you were lucky enough to watch this film on Netflix, however, you still got to see this scene as it was added back in for the Netflix release. Number 9. Not the hair. Drew wasn't always going to look the way he looks in Despicable Me 3. Other looks they tried before deciding on this final look included him wearing a big fur coat with a sweater underneath to show a more laid-back version of Gru. But they went back to their original version of Drew when they thought that the design was much more clear and concise about his personality and what he was about. And we're grateful. Number 10. Well, maybe they're not as close as we thought. In an original script for the film, there was a scene where Drew punches Gru during an argument, leading to a more dramatic moment in the film. The producers didn't believe this was within his character as written, and a bit too dark, however, and couldn't salvage the idea, so it was later removed from the film. But based on Gru's prowess, we know this family can throw a punch. Number 11. Apparently this scene was just too graphic for audiences. In another scene which exists only in a trailer and not in the final film for the first Despicable Me movie, Vector's squid gun is not only heard to latch onto someone's face, but we also get to see someone running around aimlessly with the squid attached to them. While the squid is attached to the person's face, they just yell, "Ah, there's a squid on my face, ah!" You know, sort of like that. In the film, we only see it off screen while Vector and his dad react with some indifference. Which do you prefer? Number 12. Which is worse, being despicable or being evil? The original concept for the film franchise was to call it Evil Me, with more devilish designs and a potentially more dark protagonist. As previously discussed, the filmmakers were pretty worried about making the children's films too dark, so Gru must have been upgraded from evil to just plain despicable. But what could have been? Did you like this version of Gru, or would you have preferred an even eviler Gru? The film franchise is pretty great as it is. Would you have preferred Gru to be a little more evil? Let us know in the comments. Number 13. Lucy would have never put up with this many cuts had she known. Lucy had a lot more to do in older versions of Despicable Me 3. Originally, once the family arrived in Fredonia, Lucy was going to start fighting crime and become a vigilante. This would have worked well with the character we first met in Despicable Me 2, as she was all about the law and keeping it. In the cheese festival scene in Fredonia, there was a chase scene which would have Lucy chasing a robber who stole an old woman's purse. This would have been full of slapstick moments and cheese-based puns, if you're into that sort of thing. Lucy would have had to dodge a bunch of cheese-based statues falling down, and when she finally got the robber, she was gonna say, "This is Nacho Day." Nice. In the end, the writers said they wanted Lucy's role to have a more emotional payoff this time around, rather than having a distracting vigilante storyline. So they built up more of her having a relationship with Gru's children and being a stepmom, making her role much like Gru's in the first Despicable Me film. Number 14. The filmmakers didn't always know Brat was going to be enemy number 1 in Despicable Me 3. The original idea was for Brat to simply be a henchman for another bigger criminal, but the OG villain they had written just wasn't funny enough for a movie about a weird family and 889 small yellow marshmallow men. The producer of the film said Gru needs an adversary that's not only a worthy foe, but just as funny as Steve Carell. Gru is so fun and lively, if you put a straight man in front of him, they'll just disappear. Eventually, once they saw the design for Brat, they saw more potential than they first thought. So we got an upgrade from sidekick to full-on 80s villain who hates Hollywood. We get it.
Hello?
Who said animated movies were just for kids? That definitely isn't the case when it comes to the Despicable Me universe, not when the Minions are involved. On the outside, Universal creates the perfect family film. But take a closer look and the franchise has plenty of scenes that were explicitly made for adults, and a lot of them aren't even subtle. Number 1. His famous robe. Hugh Hefner isn't the first person that comes to mind when you think family-friendly, but the famous Playboy founder did make an appearance in the Minions Rise of Gru, just not in the way that you're probably thinking. Of course, Universal couldn't just have Hugh Hefner make a cameo. Number 1, he isn't alive anymore, and number 2, that would be wildly inappropriate. But in the scene that takes place in Gru's childhood bedroom, Stuart hops into bed wearing Hefner's infamous red robe. A joke for the adults and one that probably flew over the majority of kids' heads.
Welcome to possibilities of other ways of living your life.
Number 2. More than a massage. Before the Minions get to take Master Chow's martial arts boot camp, they're welcomed into her studio, her massage studio, where she's working on a client. But in comes Stuart again with his not-so-clean mind with the line,
Teach-nous Kung Fu pour smoochy smoochy?
He's also gesturing between the two and therefore implying that there may be a little more than a massage about to happen. But Master Chow is quick to shut down his innuendo with some real technique.
I will teach you.
Number 3. Dress up gone wrong. For the Minions, it isn't unusual for them to don some elaborate costumes in order to execute a plan or just simply have fun. But one costume malfunction in Rise of Gru probably left some adults with raised eyebrows. One of the Minions, while dressed as a woman, loses a tennis ball from its chest. It was definitely put into the film to cut some tension between the Minions and the Vicious Six demanding to know Gru's location. However, it was definitely a moment made to pull some laughs from the non-child audience members. Number 4. An epic cameo. Believe it or not every adult scene in the Despicable Me universe is inappropriate. Sometimes there are just references that anyone born before the year 2000 just wouldn't understand. For example, in Rise of Gru, we get a hilarious cameo from famous 70s stuntman Evel Knievel. While a minion on a tricycle outcycling someone on a motorcycle is funny all by itself, for adults it's even more humorous when they recognize Evel Knievel's signature outfit and then his infamous number on the ramp a few seconds later. Number 5. A toy for the adults. Rise of Gru takes place in the 70s, so it was only natural that the creators incorporate elements that people born in that time era would understand, also known as the adults. So, before all the tablets and cell phones and even Wii's, there was the pet rock. Yes, the same pet rock that Otto traded the Vicious Six Magic Stone for when he crashed a kid's birthday party. So to children watching the film, it may have just looked like a rock with googly eyes, but for some adults in the audience, it was a definite blast from the past.
For a pet rock!
Number 6. Nixon vs. Kennedy. Just like the pet rock, there's another instance in Rise of Gru that only adults will get. When Gru auditions for the Vicious Six, he sees a villain holding a copy of the magazine Mad. On the front, the image is a poster congratulating Nixon for winning as president, and the back is congratulating John F. Kennedy on his presidential campaign. So unless a child is really versed in US history, they probably wouldn't pay any attention to the magazine. And to take it a step further, adults would probably realize it's impossible for both of these events to be happening at the same time. Not to mention the film takes place in the 70s, but these events occurred in the 60s. Number 7. A jab at real-life people. Whoever said the Despicable Me universe was unrealistic? If you've watched the films, you know that the infamous Bank of Evil pops up quite often throughout the movies. But have you ever really looked at the bank's sign? Right underneath its name, it reads, "Formerly Lehman Brothers." While that would basically be gibberish to children, adults probably remember the real-life Lehman Brothers. It was a financial service in the United States that holds the record for undergoing the biggest bankruptcy ever. Number 8. Wardrobe malfunction. In the first Minions film, the Minions take a trip to the Tower of London, where they have to triple up in order to pass as adults and get tickets. Of course, one of the Minions' goggles doubles as a woman's chest, which leads to a very awkward confrontation and stare contest with the local mime. A staring contest that only adults would really understand.
Ooh, Zelene.
Number 9. Cat calls and engine noises. The Minions may have game in the streets, but they also have game in the when it comes to flirting. From the engine revving to the toothpick and what are essentially catcalls from the Minions, this scene definitely wasn't meant for children's eyes. While anyone under the age of 13 probably thought the Minions were having some good old fun, we all know better and can see and hear the underlying meaning. Number 10. Fun with the copy machine. Adults having a little too much fun with the copy machine at an office party is a go-to gag for an R-rated or at least 14A-rated comedy. But despite the Despicable Me family-friendly audience, the creators decided having a scene like this in the film was a great idea. In this moment, the Minions continuously scan their butts and think it's hilarious. And while kids probably got a sense of what was going on, this moment was definitely meant to make the older audiences chuckle. Number 11. Stuart had a little too much fun. When Bob is declared king in Minions, of course his pals, including Stuart, would take full advantage of all the perks, including the large bathtub that really should be considered a pool. The first adult scene we get from this film is when Stuart strips down to basically nothing, wearing an outfit that is very mature-esque to take a dip. The next scene is him in the actual pool putting on a pretty adult-themed show with 2 fire hydrants. Yes, fire hydrants. Number 12. Hypnotic dancing. Let's take it back to the time when the Minions were at the Tower of London. After a successful disguise and getting into the actual tower, the 3 friends are tasked with having to get by the guards. And what better way to do that than by hypnotizing them? However, you'd think they'd hypnotize them to sleep or something. Nope. Instead, the guards start performing a pretty inappropriate dance while basically nude, which probably shouldn't have been shown to really little kids if we're all being honest. Number 13. A big adult party. What could go wrong when you round up a couple hundred Minions and bring them to the beach? Not much, besides a lot of adult activity, which in a way is kind of realistic. This beach scene in Despicable Me 2 is full of background moments you have to squint to see. Background moments that include flirting, skinny dipping, and even makeout sessions. Number 14. Staring into the camera like The Office. GRU'S wedding to Lucy is beautiful. Between the Minions serenading and the girls' speeches, truly heartwarming. However, during the couple's first dance, if you pay attention to the surrounding Minions, you'll see something happening that doesn't quite belong. If you look in the right bottom corner, you'll see a Minion looking at a guest's behind and then glancing knowingly at the camera while sticking their tongue out and making a face. Just like characters on The Office. Number 15. The Minions security check. In Despicable Me 3, the Minions find themselves in jail, a jail that they basically run, and in jail they have to go through some security protocols including searches. So while this scene where one Minion pulls down his pants and shows another Minion his behind may seem like a joke to a child, adults know that this is a common procedure for searching for illegal substances and weapons in actual prisons. With thousands of Minions, 5 movies, and 1 new sequel on its way, we've got over 100 Easter eggs from all the Despicable Me movies to talk about. Let's get cracking on those Easter eggs.
Okay, vamos.
Starting with the most recent Despicable Me movie, let's check out the Easter eggs in Minions Rise of Gru. Gru must be an Avengers fan because he makes a definite Avengers in-game reference. Gru says,
Minions, assemble!
Did anyone else spot the mystery machine in the background?
A van that looks a lot like the famous one from Scooby-Doo makes an appearance.
In this scene, Gru is seen sporting an outfit that looks like Russell's outfit in Up. Gru and the Minions pay homage to the world's favorite Candyman.
The end credits show Gru and the Minions trick-or-treating in Halloween costumes. Gru is dressed as Willy Wonka and the Minions are his Oompa Loompas.
It looks like Gru made the delicious decision to trade his freeze ray for a cheese ray. In Despicable Me, Gru uses a freeze ray, but it seems that back when he was young, his weapon was a bit more kid-friendly. The name's Gru. Felonious Gru. The opening credits looked a whole lot like those classic 007 opening credit sequences. The Vicious Six got their name from Marvel. If you are wondering where the supervillain squad got that title, it references an even more famous team of bad guys, Marvel's Sinister Six. There's a subtle shout-out when OG Stuart is turned into a chicken. It may be a reference to Pollo Loco in the OG movie. Did anyone spot Stuart's Playboy-inspired fashion? In an albeit unexpected reference, Stuart is wearing Hugh Hefner's infamous robe for bed. What child would want spiders on their wallpaper? A child whose goal is being a bad guy, of course. And while you were taking a close look at GRU'S wall, you may have noticed a Stronghold poster. Stronghold is a member of the Vicious Six, Based on this reference, maybe the Minions are Miley Cyrus fans. A Minion swings into the Illumination title screen on a disco ball the same way Miley Cyrus does on her famous Wrecking Ball.
The Minions wear these outfits referring to the bride's famous yellow suit in Kill Bill Volume 1, which also call back to Bruce Lee's jumpsuits, the famous actor and martial arts master.
According to the filmmakers, Jackie Chan was one of the biggest influences on the Minions' fight sequences. Jean-Claude's outfit is a reference to A Clockwork Orange. In another very 70s movie reference, did anyone spot that Jaws poster? Yes, there's a poster of the world's most famous shark hanging on the wall in the movie theater. Speaking of Jean-Claude's name, this character's namesake is actually his voice actor. His name is a pun based on the name of Jean-Claude Van Damme, the famous martial artist and actor who voices Jean-Claude. One Vicious Six member's outfit is a rollerball reference. Fittingly for Rise of Gru's major 1970s undertones, Rollerball is a 1975 science fiction movie about, of course, rollerball. There's a vision of the future in this prequel, and it comes in the form of Silas Ramsbottom. He was introduced in Despicable Me 2, and a younger version of him appears in Rise of Gru. It's clear that members of the Despicable Me universe can get a Mad Magazine subscription. If you pay close attention, you can spot a villain in the Vicious Six waiting room reading Mad Magazine. Since Rise of Gru, pink toilet paper has officially become a Despicable Me staple. There's pink toilet paper in the airplane bathroom, just like in Despicable Me 3. Pink toilet paper is only found in France, so this is likely a reference to French culture. Otto must be an aspiring stunt performer because he's following in Evel Knievel's footsteps. Or should we say, motorcycle tracks. Did Master Chow's voice remind you of anything? Yes, Michelle Yeoh voices Master Chow. And this is a pretty self-referential casting choice, since tough Master Chow would be good at playing a lot of Yeoh's action movie characters. When Gru tries his best to insult Wild Knuckles, the villain is less than impressed, and he calls Gru no Don Rickles. Don Rickles was a comedian who was particularly good at funny insults, and during the time of Rise of Gru, this funny guy would have been at peak fame. Going back in time, next up is the first Minions movie to be added to the Despicable Me franchise, which was aptly named Minions. These guys were actually modeled to look a lot like Gru's daughters. From glasses to height differences, it's pretty easy to tell Margot, Agnes, and Edith's Minion counterparts. Did you spot the Richard Nixon joke in NYC? It's a joke that's definitely designed for the grown-ups watching. Was that the big comfy couch that the Minions passed when flipping through channels? In a subtle reference only a true 90s kid could love, the Minions come across the 90s favorite kids show when channel surfing. And speaking of 90s TV favorites, we also catch a glimpse of Dragon Tales. The Minions watch a Woody Woodpecker short that's called Three Little Woodpeckers. And yes, if you're wondering, this is owned by Universal. If you thought the Minion language was gibberish, it's time to think again. The Minions' native tongue is way more complicated than that. It's actually composed of many different languages.
Dr. Nefario may not be as big a part of the Minions movie as he is in other Despicable Me movies, but he still makes an appearance.
You can spot the Doc in the background at VillainCon. VillainCon is more inspired by Comic-Con than you may initially think. VillainCon's logo references San Diego Comic-Con's logo. The moon was a vital part of the OG Despicable Me, and in Minions the reference is specifically to the moon landing. When the Minions end up on a moon set, there is a reference to the conspiracy theory that the moon landing in 1969 was in fact all a lie. Mozart fans may have noticed this reference to the famous opera The Magic Flute. Did you know that the fire hydrants are all a reference to this? You can also hear Kevin whistling Der Vogelfänger bin ich ja, which is a song from the opera. Even Papagena, the name Stewart gives one of the hydrants, is named after one of the opera's characters. When Bob becomes king, that's definitely a reference to The Sword in the Stone, and the sword looks a lot like the kind in the 1963 Disney version. Gru's mom makes a little cameo in this movie as well. The Minions destroy a painting of Marlena Gru herself.
The reference to the Beatles' Abbey Road isn't exactly subtle. Stewart, Bob, and Kevin pop up from underground just as the Beatles walk across the crosswalk, like in that famous image.
There are also a few of the Fab Four's songs to be heard. Got to Get You Into My Life plays as the credits roll, and Revolution is performed by the Minions during the after-credits scene. Since Minions takes place in the famous English city, it makes its fair share of jokes at Londoners' expense. Among these jokes is plenty of references to British folks' stereotypical love of tea. As if the Minions director didn't have enough work on his hands making this movie, did you know that he also voiced every single Minion? Yes, director Pierre Coffin is the man behind the Minions. He was the voice of all 899 of them. The design of the evil Minions was based on a Looney Tunes episode where Tweety Bird drinks a potion and turns into a big scary Tweety Bird. Both Tweety Bird and the Minions are little, yellow, and not actually evil at all. Moving on to Despicable Me 3, this third Despicable Me installment actually has the most Easter eggs of any of them. Let's start with the major Sing reference. When the Minions enter the Sing competition, it's just like the other Illumination animated movie. Speaking of references to other animated favorites, Nemo and Marlin from Pixar's Finding Nemo seem to be underwater in this submarine scene. If you love Easter eggs, Margot's t-shirt collection is usually a good place to look. She wears a Grinch t-shirt that references the legendary Dr. Seuss Christmas character. Gru and Dru's appearances are a sneaky reference for comic book fans. The brotherly duo is based on Spy vs. Spy characters. Like Gru and Dru, Spy vs. Spy is about two super spies who wear coordinating black and white outfits. Star Wars lovers, did you catch the nod to The Empire Strikes Back? Dr. Nefario gets frozen in carbonite, and we all remember when that happened in the Star Wars universe. Another adventure movie that gets a shout out in this film, Raiders of the Lost Ark. They steal what looks to be the same statue that Indiana Jones once stole. Balthazar Brad is a major 80s fan, and he doesn't have to talk about his love of the decade past for us to figure that out. His name is Brat, a nod to the group of young movie stars from the 1980s, the Brat Pack. And speaking of all those 80s references, there are quite a few others to be found, from moonwalking like Michael Jackson to loving Madonna and Phil Collins. Despicable Me 3 doesn't just go back to the 80s, it also goes back to the future. GRU'S car reminds any film aficionado of the famous DeLorean from Back to the Future. When the Minions are in prison, there's a Jailhouse Rock reference. Stuart must be a major rock lover. He plays Van Halen music because Stuart really rocks. The stuffed unicorn appears in 2 Despicable Me films. The one from the first movie also appears in the third. The famous minion Mel has a very special namesake. He's named after Chris Meledandri, the CEO of Illumination. If the name Fredonia sounded familiar to you, you may be a Marx Brothers fan. The city name is a reference to one of the wacky comedian's most famous films, Duck Soup. It looks like Lucy is a lover of Easter eggs just like we are. She actually points out that the ceiling looks just like the Sistine Chapel, but with some unexpected pig cameos. Did you notice a headstone referencing Butch Cassidy in Dru's lair? One headstone reads Grutch Cassidy, which sounds a lot like a portmanteau of Gru and famous bank robber Butch Cassidy. This layer is filled with odes to other famous villains, including Hannibal Lecter. There's a statue that looks a lot like Gru sporting a Hannibal Lecter mask. That's not the end of nightmare fodder to be found in Dru's lair. There's also an evil clown that looks like Gru playing Pennywise in another remake of It. The filmmakers have said that Gru and Dru are yin and yang. There's a kind of yin-yang symbol on Gru's Despicamobile, and Gru and Dru are often dressed in black and white, just like the symbol. Despicable Me's Gru and Dru are some of Steve Carell's most beloved roles, so it's really no wonder that this movie references one of Carell's other most famous roles, Michael Scott in The Office. There are a few moments in this movie that remind us of the Pink Panther. Balthazar's diamond is definitely a Pink Panther reference, and we think the credit sequence also reminds us of the classic mystery franchise. We all remember the OG Despicable Me fart gun, and this super silly weapon is used in the third installment during the Illumination credit in the beginning of the movie. Despicable Me has a delicious dessert called Brad and Gary ice cream. This is certainly a pun on the famous ice cream company Ben & Jerry's. But where did the new name come from? That would be Illumination's short film Brad and Gary. When the Minions perform, there's a subtle callback to the animated favorite The Secret Life of Pets. The Minions sure can dance, and their choreography is just like the hot dogs dance in the other Illumination flick. When Brat's robot is wreaking havoc on Hollywood, there's a billboard advertising a movie called Onions that's coming soon. Onions is not the best name for a movie, but it does sound a lot like Minions. So this was probably a teaser to the next Despicable Me movie. It's no surprise that there are more sneaky billboards to be spotted in this scene. Another billboard is for something called Fast Car Driver 12. Any idea what that might be? It's a nod to the famous Fast and Furious franchise. Another billboard references Jurassic World. The Gigantosaurus Rex billboard is definitely poking fun at the plot of Jurassic World. In the beginning of the movie, a submarine turns into a bike like in The Dark Knight. A ship called Poseidon isn't likely to trick anyone. In that beginning scene, you can spot a boat with Poseidon written on the side, which is definitely a reference to the Poseidon movies. If all the nods to Universal Pictures movies weren't enough, there's a more on-the-nose Universal Pictures reference. The Minions actually break into Universal Studios' set. It's amazing that one donut can be so recognizable. Agnes has a donut in her backpack, and it's not just any old donut. It's a reference to the Simpsons donut. In case it wasn't clear enough that Balthazar Bratt was an 80s fan through and through, just check out what's under his bed. There's a VHS tape hiding under his bed, and it's the 1986 sci-fi hit Aliens. There's also a VHS tape of a real 50s sci-fi movie called It Conquered the World. During the Pig Police chase, two children are reenacting Romeo and Juliet in the background. The I Heart Gru hat now says I Heart Drew. The brothers actually share a similar story to the twins in The Parent Trap. And like in that movie, both sets of twins are played by the same actor. Did you see those skulls on GRU'S boxers? This choice of underwear is a nod to the Punisher. Did the idea of a car that can dig into the ground remind you of another animated favorite? It's just like the one in The Incredibles. What's more Hollywood than Marilyn Monroe? Well, there's a woman holding her skirt on the Hollywood Walk of Fame just the way Marilyn Monroe famously did. Balthazar is a major Guardians of the Galaxy reference. He carries a Walkman with 80s music and loves dance battles. Remind you of anyone? Star-Lord, of course. Speaking of space, there's another reference to the original movie when Gru wanted to steal the moon. As Gru wonders whether he should be good or evil, the view of the moon and his spacesuit in the corner reference when Gru used to be the bad guy. Bratt dresses up in a costume that looks a lot like Donald Trump. You can't deny that that's his signature hairdo. Yes, when the Minions are in prison, they snap their fingers and dance like the Sharks vs. Jets famously do in West Side Story. Moving on to the first ever Despicable Me sequel, Despicable Me 2, it looks like the world of Despicable Me has the same banana suppliers as we do. The bananas all have Chiquita Bananas labels on them. Did you know that when this movie came out, you could actually call Lucy? For a period of time after the movie came out, you could actually call the number and hear Kristen Wiig herself giving Lucy's voicemail message. This beach photo appears in the first movie as GRU'S phone wallpaper. That same photo is hanging up where Dr. Nefario works. With these non-English jokes, Spanish speakers are sure to have the last laugh. You might have caught this poster that, translated to English, reads, "If you are drinking to forget, pay first." Did you notice any difference between the yellow guy's smiles in the first movie and the second? Their teeth were not exactly straight in the OG Despicable Me, but by the time the sequel rolled around, they had perfect pearly whites. Margot has another interesting t-shirt choice, but this time it's not a cartoon. Her t-shirt references Bayside Shakedown. This TV series is a police dramedy from the late 90s. El Macho's storyline references Dr. Strangelove. The villain El Macho's wacky death, where he straps himself to a bomb before riding a shark, may have reminded you of a storyline in Dr. Strangelove. Edith says that Gru looks like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. Now let's unpack all the hidden jokes in the original Despicable Me, starting with the Wilhelm scream. As one of the most famous sound effects ever, the Wilhelm scream is a scream that can be heard in many movies and TV series from the 50s through today. In Despicable Me, Gru's mom accidentally kicks a man who's behind the punching bag she's really aiming for. This time, Margot sports a t-shirt featuring Dr. Seuss's The Lorax. The Bank of Evil has an interesting historic backstory. There's a shot of the Bank of Evil that says formerly Lehman Brothers beneath it. This is a joke for the grown-ups in the audience that implies that the famously closed financial firm is back in action. Vector steals a pyramid at the beginning, but he doesn't do the best job of hiding it. After he steals the pyramid, it can later be spotted in humorously conspicuous disguise. Bob wears one important crown in this movie. During his coronation, Bob wears the British royal crown, and it's clear that one of the minions swiped it. Did you catch the paintings on Gru's wall? The artwork Gru has in his house proves that he's actually a pretty good thief. He's got the Mona Lisa and Van Gogh's Starry Night. There is one particularly unlucky kid in the Despicable Me universe. In this movie, Gru famously pops this child's balloon. The same child appears in Despicable Me 2, and his toy explodes. When Gru reads a story to the girls, it's actually a real book called Sleepy Kittens.
They're ready to see you, Mr. Gru.
Oh, good. Great.
Minions: The Rise of Gru is the new addition to the Despicable Me franchise,
This is the biggest day of my life!
and it is certainly shaking things up. Everyone's talking about that ending, so what does this really mean for the Minions? Number 1. Will Wild Knuckles be back? Wild Knuckles is the newest villain in A Tale About Villains, and this movie sure had us biting our nails wondering if Wild Knuckles would live on to throw another punch.
Oh, I didn't mean to scare you.
Once the fight was over, the character was in pretty bad shape. Even so, he lived long enough to be captured. While we were led to believe that he met his untimely end in prison, Gru later spotted him hiding behind a tree. Wild Knuckles went on to say that he'd faked the whole thing, and Gru, of course, aspires to fool the world in a similar way in the future.
You seriously think a puny little child can be a villain?
Yes, I am pretty despicable.
So, is Wild Knuckles gone for good? It sure doesn't seem like it. We bet we'll be seeing that guy again.
Are you pulling on my legs right now?
Number 2. What happened to the Vicious Six? Thanks to Gru and some serious teamwork, the members of the Vicious Six were rendered powerless and suffered the unfortunate fate of being turned into rats.
Why don't we make this a fair fight?
This ends the film's conflict, but it's interesting to note that this silly squad of villains wasn't necessarily defeated once and for all. We can't be sure we'll see these rats in future movies, but we've got a feeling we haven't seen the last of them either. Number 3. Ending Easter eggs. This may be a prequel, but that doesn't mean there's no trace of what's to come in this journey to the past. And this ending delivered some references to the Despicable Me movies that came before. In the end, Gru's pals tell him to shoot for the moon, which we all know he will certainly grow up to do. And speaking of the moon, during the post-credits scene, the heroes of this villain story fly off in a ship. Did that ship look familiar to you? Yep, that's Grumobile in the OG Despicable Me movie. Ah yes, it's all coming together. Number 4. Inside the post-credits scene. Speaking of that post-credits scene, if you haven't seen Minions: Rise of Gru yet, make sure you hit the bathroom before you take your seat in the theater, because you're gonna want to stay until after the credits roll. The post-credits scene is all about Dr. Nefario. The scene shows a young Gru and his minions visiting Dr. Nefario and doing some serious coaxing to get him to join them. Eventually he's convinced, and the whole team flies off in that familiar spaceship. We love a happy ending, or in this case, it's more of a happy beginning. Number 5. Good vs. Evil. This prequel's ending sets the stage for a story all about good and evil. In a movie about supervillains, is there really a good guy? Seeing how Gru grew to be the lovable ex-villain we know and love gave some insight into about who Gru really is. In the end, Minions: The Rise of Gru looks at what it means to be good versus evil. And the movie's ending proves that while Gru wants nothing more than to be the best at being a bad guy, he has too much care for those around him to ever be an actual villain.
I need a good night's sleep, so get out.
Oh.
Fine, because you had a nightmare.
Number 6. Teamwork makes the dream work. This movie's ending also proved that having the right people in your life can make all the difference. This film wasn't just Gru's origin story. It also captured the moment when he learned that he simply couldn't do it all alone. Gru learned all about trust and teamwork, and that he needs his team around to help him carry out his plans. And of course, leaning on the people around you is central to Despicable Me as a whole. The Minions may be wacky, but their loyalty is what friends are for.
Hey, minibus! Guys!
Number 7. What's in store for Despicable Me 4? Despicable Me is currently the highest-grossing animated film franchise in history. So it's safe to say you'll never have to go too long without a new addition to this fan-favorite story. The newest sequel, Despicable Me 4, is set to come out in July of 2024. And while we have to sit tight and wait to see Gru back in action, we've got a feeling that this latest prequel gave us some insight as to what we can expect to see in the future. Since Wild Knuckles is definitely not dead, it's pretty safe to say that we haven't seen the last of him. What that could mean for the next movie is unclear so far. And of course, we saw how Gru teamed up with Nefario and the Minions, so our faves are certainly going to be back come 2024. What's Despicable Me without the Minions, right?
I love you too.
Alright.
What are your thoughts on Minions: The Rise of Gru? What hints do you think the movie gave us for Despicable Me 4 and the future of our favorite characters? Tell us all about your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to The Things Animated for all the latest animation news.